In the early 1990s, in the wild bush on the outskirts of Sydney, Australia, the murdered bodies of young tourists began to be unearthed. The gruesome finds revealed shocking levels of violence with scant disregard for life. These murders became known as the backpacker murders and would lead to the biggest serial killer investigation in the history of Australia. Ivan Robert Milat was the third son of a Croatian migrant and an Australian mother. One of 14 children, he grew up on the outskirts of Sydney in an atmosphere of violence and fear. His father would beat him with a piece of 2x4. His mother slashed her son Boris with a knife and broke his arm with a tomato stake. She took an axe to an intruder who fled screaming, leaving 4 bloodied fingers on the windowsill. In the 50s, the sweet-faced boy became a thug. Cars and guns were his passion. As a teenager, Ivan graduated from stealing and breaking into service stations to armed robberies, kidnapping, and rape. He spent most of the 1960s in prison, 7 years and 2 months. He seduced his brother's wife, producing a child, and the brother twice tried to kill him. He seduced another brother's wife. He too came after him with a gun. All the brothers were capable of extreme violence. When Ivan married a young local girl, he would lead her into the quiet state forest of Belangolo and shoot kangaroos. She would later recall that she had got the impression he had done something wrong and would not tell her. When she managed to flee the sadistic marriage, he torched her parents' car for revenge. He couldn't understand why she had left. She had been scared of him for some time, and his treatment of her had become extreme. If she defied him, he would punish her and beat her and pull her about by the hair. The smallest thing would send him into a rage. For sex, he liked to push her without warning over the kitchen table and sodomize her, a trick he said he'd learned in prison. In 1971, he picked up 2 young women hitchhiking from Liverpool to Melbourne. Over the course of a long weekend, he kept them tied up, threatened them with knives, and raped them. At least another 8 hitchhikers would encounter Ivan Milat. They would be abducted, robbed, sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered. 20 years later, in April '92, Joanne Waters and Caroline Clarke were 2 British backpackers on holiday in Australia. They'd left their motel in Sydney King's Cross to hitchhike toward Melbourne to look for casual seasonal work. Joanne Waters was 22. Caroline Clarke was 21. Neither girl were known to be promiscuous.
That's the one, you got it.
As backpackers, they were instant prey for any predators who came upon them, safe targets who wouldn't be missed for some time. After traveling a few miles along the Hume Highway, Ivan Milat suddenly took a shortcut through Belangolo Forest and turned the car onto a dirt road. Joanne Waters would be stabbed in the heart and lungs 14 times, 5 of which would be savage enough to cut her spine and sever 2 ribs. Clarke would be stabbed once and shot in the head 10 times, the bullets entering from 3 different angles, indicating her killer used her as target practice, moving her head between shots. The first shot would have killed her. The remaining 9 can only have fulfilled some kind of fantasy of being a hitman or executioner. Five months later, their skeletal remains were found by 2 cross-country runners in the dense Belangolo State Forest.
2 orienteerers running in the Belangolo State Forest discovered the first body yesterday afternoon. This morning, as police resumed the search for clues, another badly decomposed body of a woman was found just 30 metres from the scene of yesterday's discovery. Detectives are in no doubt the women have been murdered, the killer making a feeble attempt to conceal the bodies. There was no sign of any murder weapon. It could have been dumped anywhere in the 5 kilometres of pine forest between the bush graves and the F5 freeway west of Bowral. Homicide detectives will have to wait for the results of a post-mortem tomorrow before they can establish if the bodies are those of missing British tourists Joanne Walters and Caroline Clarke. Neither has been seen since April.
Over the next 5 days, 40 police searched a corridor 500 feet wide and 1.5 miles long. They did not find any more bodies, nor did they find the camping gear and personal items belonging to the 2 girls. Police issued a statement saying the forest was clean and wound down their investigation. Caroline Clarke and Joanne Waters were the first bodies found, but the last to be killed. 13 months later, in October 1993, the forest gave up 2 more of its gruesome secrets.
The first body was discovered just after 1:30 this afternoon by a local man cutting timber in the Belangolo State Forest. Less than 3 hours later, more human remains were found off a nearby fire trail. Detectives say the skull and bones were less than 500 metres from where the bodies of murdered British backpackers Joanne Walters and Caroline Clarke were discovered in August last year. Police are investigating the possibility the remains are those of 2 Melbourne backpackers who disappeared while hitchhiking to Albury. Debbie Everest and James Gibson were last seen 3 years ago on the way to a hippie festival.
The next day, Superintendent Commander Clive Small, one of Australia's most experienced major crime detectives, was put on the case.
I got a call at work and it was asked by the then Region Commander to go down and assess the situation where these skeletons had been recovered down in Belangolo State Forest. I rang home, asked my wife to throw in a couple of shirts. I drove straight home, got them, said goodbye, and I'll be back later that night or the next morning, and then drove straight down to the forest, which is about 150 kilometres south of Sydney. When I got down there, it was, to say the least, chaotic. The media were there in full force. The police had set up an initial site, but trying to control the media and trying to get a search and control of the whole situation was quite chaotic at that time.
What are they doing here? They walked back from the white line. Get rid of them.
My assessment was that we needed to get more police, we needed to get a proper campsite set up, and we needed to get control of the media. We had a very isolated crime scene. We had victims who were backpackers and therefore isolated from their families and friends who knew about them. There was a long time between the murders and the police visitation at the crime scene, so a lot of evidence would have been destroyed.
We're working on the second one.
The two new bodies discovered were those of James Gibson and Deborah Everest, two Australians who'd gone missing 3 years earlier in 1989. James Gibson had been stabbed in the spine, the breastbone, both sides of the chest, and in the upper back. The zipper fly on his jeans was open, but the top button was still done up. Deborah Everest had been stabbed in the spine. There were several fractures in the skull, and there were 4 slash marks on her forehead. A pair of grey tights and a black bra with a stab wound in one of the cups was found nearby.
And where were the British backpackers found?
It was about 100 metres just through here, sir.
In fact, we'll sweep right through the whole area, right down through here. And let's take the perimeter out 500 metres further that way.
Sir, we need more men for that.
We'll get them. Let's go.
There were several things that were particularly chilling about the murders. It's quite clear that in a number of cases, at least, if not all the cases, the victims did not die immediately, but were alive for a period of time. The way in which the murders were actually executed were particularly vicious and calculating, and I think it showed a deal of time was spent at the crime scene, and all the victims, in my view, must have undergone horrific fright and fear before the murders actually occurred. I think what the crime scenes told me, and what the advice of psychiatrists and other people we spoke to told me, was that this was a killer who was particularly vicious, who was particularly cold, and who was particularly calculating. We had a serial killer who we believed would continue to kill until he was caught.
The next day, Task Force Air was set up in offices above a converted hat factory. The team was quickly assembled to deal with the many thousands of pieces of information that had already begun pouring in. The next task was to set up a public hotline and cooperation with the media.
Task Force Air.
From the outset, there was an enormous amount of information coming in to police sources. A lot of that was through the media, a lot of that was direct, and a lot of it was to local police. We had to make sure that we gathered all of that together.
The first priority was a search of the forest and a ballistics check on the gun.
Every Ruger .22 caliber rifle that's been sold in this country over the last 10 years.
2 weeks after murdering Deborah Everest and James Gibson, Ivan Milat got the chance to kill again. Paul Onions was a 24-year-old ex-British Navy sailor looking for a ride on the Hume Highway. His only possessions were a small pack containing a Sony Walkman and camera, and several items of clothing. For Milat, as in all the murders, a chance sighting was all he needed to select a victim.
That's your lucky day. Cheers.
It would take another 3 years before the meeting of Paul Onions and Ivan Milat would become a significant break in the backpacker murder investigation. By By the end of October 93, 4 bodies had been found within 500 metres of each other in the Belanglo State Forest southwest of Sydney. In its first 24 hours, the toll-free hotline set up by Task Force Air had received over 5,000 calls. Police were inundated with leads and every piece of information had to be checked. To strengthen its investigation squad, Commander Small assembled a team of experts to examine the motives and the state of mind of the killer.
Further away and saying you're going to escape, they're going to shoot.
All right,
But how far
why not shoot?
Commander Small's team of specialists came up with a profile that described the killer, who would be a loner, have a fascination with guns, be a semi-skilled worker and live on the outskirts of town, drive a 4x4 and motorbikes, be aggressive to authority, and have a history of bisexual activity. They also suggested there may be more than one killer involved, perhaps brothers, with the older one more dominant over the more submissive, yet equally sadistic younger brother. They would share a common interest in firearms and would have committed crimes together before. They suggested checking for weird semi-criminal families living in the area.
One interesting suggestion that was made was that we should consider going to schools that were in the southwest of Sydney, finding teachers, many of whom would be retired, who would have taught young males who would be around about 45 at that time, and ask them if they had any problem children in the school that they thought was going to turn out to be a problem in later life.
While police began combing local schools, the search for the weapon continued. The 10-22 Ruger rifle police were looking for was one of over 40,000 imported into Australia. But the shell cases were Winchester .22 subsonic rounds and were part of a batch distributed to a relatively small number of gun shops in New South Wales.
There was canvassing being done of gun shops. There was a tracing of the types of bullets and shells that were used, where there was a very substantial check done of the Winchester factory in Melbourne. All of those really contributed to a thorough investigation of good policemanship.
26 days later, police found a 5th body, buried nearly 3 miles from the previous killing site.
The search of the Belanglo State Forest was winding down yesterday when more human remains were found in the area known as Executioner's Drop.
The media went into a panic.
The backpacker murder hunt and forensic tests start soon to find the cause of death of a 5th body found in the Belanglo State Forest near Bowral. Police
New South Wales Police this morning continue the state's largest ever homicide investigation on the heels of yesterday's gruesome discovery.
We have what appears to be the almost complete skeletal remains of one person.
20-year-old Simone Schmiedel was last seen alive in January 1991 and was believed to have been hitchhiking from Sydney to Melbourne. In the grim parlance of serial murder investigations, yesterday's discovery was made at a location that's become known as Executioner's Drop.
It was covered with branches, leaves in a similar manner to the other 4. We have simply just taken the top covering of the grave, if you like, and that has allowed us to make some very significant observations at this stage.
Simone Schmiedel's body was partially dressed with her skirt and undergarments pushed up around her neck. She'd been stabbed in the spine, which would have completely severed her spinal cord, paralyzing her but keeping her alive. She was then repeatedly stabbed in the front and back of her body. Pathologists described it as a frenzied attack, an act of rage. Police immediately extended their search. Another 40 officers joined the existing 60-strong search party in what was now known as Australia's backpacker graveyard. The murder inquiry was now the largest investigation of its kind in Australian criminal history. Near the skeletal remains were found a pair of pink jeans which did not belong to Simone, a cartridge box which once contained .22 caliber bullets, and a length of blue and yellow rope. The whole area was scattered with evidence, but what chilled police most was the remains of a brick fire and cigarette stubs. The killer was now obviously taking his time and experimenting with methods of death.
With serial killers, each incident is an experience for them, and they tend to, once they've completed it, say, now I did that fairly well, but how could I make it better next time? What could I do to do a better job next time? And so their patterns of behaviour become more ritualistic, more thorough, more detailed, and you could in fact see that sort of pattern emerging where they appeared to be spending longer times at the scene.
Find! 2 days later, victim 6 was found. Then, within a couple of hours, victim 7.
The personal side of these investigations, I think, are always very difficult to handle, irrespective of what you tell yourself internally. Members of the team do take it very personally. They do get a very strong sense of moral indignation about what's happened. They do tend to develop a strong empathy with the family and friends of victims. And it becomes a very emotional and a very draining thing.
This latest discovery was made by a police search team just after midday at the edge of the forest.
At this stage, the bodies are still in location they were found. I think it's fair to say that given that we now have 7 bodies recovered, and notwithstanding that we don't know the cause of death in the present case, that we do have a serial killer.
It was the first time police acknowledged what everybody already knew, and the media went into a frenzy.
Forensic experts are now checking dental records.
Flew into Belanglo State Forest yesterday, armed with the dental records of missing backpackers Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied. Overnight examination of the
to confirm if the bodies are those of missing German backpackers Anja Habschied and Gabor Neugebauer, who disappeared from a King's Cross youth hostel almost 2 years ago.
This morning, New South Wales Premier John Fahey arrived at Belanglo, where he was briefed by police involved in the investigation. A short time ago, the Premier visited the site where Neugebauer's and Habschied's bodies were found.
The political pressure on Commander Small was now intense. The Premier vowed before the cameras to catch the killer and announced a reward for public information.
It is appropriate for a reward to be offered, and I want to announce a reward of $500,000.
Last night, they informed the victims' parents in Germany that the bodies were of their children. Task Force Commander Clive Small also confirmed that all victims discovered so far probably died of horrific stab wounds.
As a parent myself, I felt I had some understanding of what the parents and relatives of these victims must have been going through. And there's a sense in which you would like to get the media coverage toned down or cut out even completely for the sake of the relatives and the family, because they don't want to be reading about what's happened to their children day in and day out, or hearing different conspiracy theories and suggestions being made.
Gabor Neugebauer's body was found beneath a log, which took 3 detectives to lift, indicating it had been put there by more than one man. The young German had been gagged and strangled, his jaw was broken in several places, and there were 6 bullet holes in his skull. The zip on his jeans was open with the top button still done up. Anja Habschied had been beheaded, and the head kept as a souvenir. The medical examiner concluded the head would have been severed while she was in a kneeling position, as if in some form of ritual decapitation. The head would never be recovered, and psychologists believe Milat took it with him as a trophy. 4 bullets were recovered from inside Gabor Neugebauer's skull. After examination under a comparison microscope, The bullets and shell casing showed conclusively that the same weapon had been used in the killing of Caroline Clarke. In less than a month, 5 kids had turned up dead, 3 in 1 week. The body count was now 7, and by December '93 it was apparent the investigation wasn't progressing very far.
When I was given the job, my initial reaction was probably, there's a good chance this won't be solved. And the reasoning behind that was, you know, the fact they were backpackers, the isolation, the time lapse, the degradation of evidence at the crime scene, the fact that there didn't appear to be anywhere to go.
All the others were buried deep, right? So, I mean, this guy was shot, then, got him, then he came in after her.
But what about the different...
Yeah, but it's the way the difference was that they were killed. Like this one was shot, that one was bashed, that one was stabbed. It's got to be more than one person.
But hang on, what we've got to have is decapitations as well.
What Commander Small didn't know at the time was that 12,000 miles away in Birmingham, England, was the break he needed. That break was Paul Onions. When Ivan Milat picked him up at the gas station in 1990, the young Englishman backpacking himself around Australia was glad of the lift. Milat introduced himself as Bill, told him he worked on the roads, was from a Yugoslavian family, lived near Liverpool, and was divorced.
It's taken me a while to start myself up for it.
Mate, you need to pick up your attitude a bit, I'll tell you. You really do.
By mid-afternoon, after leaving the southern town of Mittagong, Bill began acting strangely, varying his speed and looking in the rear-view mirror every few seconds. His demeanor changed, and his speech became aggressive.
Because I need to pull over. Just gonna get some tapes out of the back, okay? Got a gut full of your bloody attitude, mate. Just stay there.
Onions was now feeling extremely uneasy. The Navy had taught him to read people and expect the bad in everyone. Everything inside him was telling him something was wrong.
What's wrong with you? I said stay in the car! Put on your bloody seatbelt! Now! Hurry up! Do it!
5 kilometers ahead, to the west, the bodies of Deborah Everest and James Gibson lay 3.5 weeks decomposed in a grave of leaf and twig. At Bowral, police took a statement, filed it and forgot about it. 5 months later, Paul Onions went back to England. It would be another 3 years before his role in the Milat case would become crucial. Two months after his last killings, Milat began a relationship with Chalinda Hughes. On their first date, he took her to see Basic Instinct and was embarrassed by the content of the sex thriller. To their friends and family, they seemed an odd coupling, particularly because Chalinda was black. The Milats hated blacks.
Yeah, gorgeous.
For Ivan, there was stability in his life and the killings suddenly stopped. Five bodies had now turned up in less than 4 weeks, and with the 2 British girls found a year earlier, the total was now 7. The gruesome nature of the murders had shocked the country. Most of the victims had first been stabbed in the spine, paralyzing them, but keeping them alive while being assaulted and beaten, stabbed, bludgeoned, tortured, strangled, suffocated, shot, decapitated. The backpacker murderer was now Australia's most brutal serial killer, and the police were no closer to catching him. Of the thousands of calls received over the hotline, police had produced a list of 2,000 persons of interest. One of the leads folders was named Milat. The Milat family were local and exactly fitted the police profile. They were straight out of the movie Deliverance.
By January, the Milat family and Ivan Milat had in fact come well into focus in the inquiry. We had in fact received a number of calls from people who suggested that various members of the Milat family would make good suspects because of their fascination with firearms and handguns and continually carrying weapons in cars and this sort of thing.
Detectives called at Ivan's last known place of work. They checked the work records and found Ivan absent on every day the backpackers went missing. They checked his rap sheet, and it came up like a rash on the computer screen. But what intrigued police most was the 1971 charge of abducting 2 hitchhikers, tying them up and raping them. He'd picked them up on the Hume Highway outside Liverpool, drove on a few miles, then pulled onto a dirt road, produced a knife and threatened to kill them if they didn't have sex with him. Police tracked down one of the girls.
Oh, well, he said that he expected to assault one of us or he was going to kill us. All of the time that I was with him, I was afraid that he would kill me.
And who was the man who assaulted you?
Oh, Ivan Milat.
Then in 1979, 2 more women escaped to tell their story. One of them said it was Milat who abducted her as she hitchhiked to Canberra.
And he just closed his door, turned around and grabbed her in the front and said, "Okay, girls, which one of you wants it first?"
The women made a run for it and hid in the bushes.
Extremely lucky. Extremely lucky. That, you know, wasn't. I think we were just the practice run.
Theirs could have been the bodies uncovered as the Belangolo forest began yielding its gruesome secrets.
When I saw the record, you got a very strong feeling as this really could be the person. This really could be the guy we're after.
Ivan Milat was now a prime suspect. Commander Small deputized 5 detectives to work full-time following up the Milat leads. He also arranged for a surveillance team known as the Dog Squad to follow Milat and watch his house. He was put under 24-hour surveillance and his house and car were bugged. Everything told them they had their man, but they couldn't prove a thing.
The purpose of the surveillance was twofold. One was a concern that if he was this serial murder, we didn't want him to go and murder someone else. But the second reason was also because we were concerned to know his movements, to get an idea of his pattern of behaviour and movements. And there were also a number of covert activities we wished to undertake, and before we undertook them, we wanted to know where he was.
The case was now receiving worldwide press. From England, police got a call on the hotline.
Hello.
Is this the New South Wales Police hotline? My name, Paul Onions. I'm calling from...
Onions told them the whole story of the man who had picked him up on the Hume Highway and had tried to kill him. He was sure the incident was connected to the backpacker murders. This report was also noted, filed, and promptly lost. 5 months later, it was found buried amongst the pile of discarded leads. Detective Gordon couldn't believe what he was reading. Here was a credible witness that could link the vehicle, the area, and the driver.
Yes. What is it?
2 independent reports of an attack on a British backpacker.
What was his name?
Paul Onions.
And where did it happen?
The Belanglo State Forest near the Hume Highway.
Take your time.
A week later, a surprised Onions was on a plane to Sydney. Police told him he'd escaped only 2 kilometres from the entrance of the Belanglo Forest.
That's him. That's the one who attacked me.
Sir, Onions just given us a positive ID on Ivan Milat.
Thank you.
With the ID secured, Commander Small stepped up the painstaking search for evidence on the murders. When the Nissan Patrol 4-wheel drive owned by Ivan Milat was found, its new owner was interviewed and showed police a bullet he had found under the driver's seat. It was a .22 caliber and matched the cartridge cases found at the Clarke and Waters gravesite. Milat had sold the vehicle 2 months after the bodies had been discovered. Detectives then re-interviewed brother Alec Milat's wife.
They'd finished the conversation when the wife, just absolutely out of the blue, without questions being asked, said, "Oh, by the way, Ivan gave us this."
Ivan did give me this.
The backpack wasn't Australian. It was unique to Germany and belonged to Simone Schmiedel.
The backpack was in effect the first piece of hard evidence that we had. That caused us to firm up our decision to basically go in.
At 2 a.m. on May 22nd, 300 police set off on the 11 simultaneous raids. Police were still unsure if any of the brothers were involved, so all the Milat homes were to be hit at the same time.
When we decided to go in, there was a very high sense of tension. We knew that Ivan was certainly dangerous, and there were reasons to believe that other members of the family were also dangerous.
At 6:30 a.m., 50 armed police officers had surrounded Ivan Milat's home in Eaglevale. Chief negotiator, Detective Wayne Gordon, picked up the phone.
Hello.
Mr. Ivan Milat, is it?
Nah.
Is Ivan Milat there?
Nah, mate, no Ivan Milat here.
He's at the premises of 22 Cinnabar Street, Eaglevale.
Yep.
Mate, Detective Sergeant Gordon's my name. I'm a negotiator with the State Protection Group.
Police are around those premises, and they're in the possession of a search warrant.
To search the premises in regard to an armed robbery matter.
No, Jay.
I want you to come straight out of the front door and walk straight up onto the front lawn.
Oh, yeah?
You'll find police officers outside the house who'll then give you directions on what they want you to do. And when you leave the front door open, mate. Tell me, who's in the house with you?
Oh, just my girlfriend.
Okay, mate. Listen, will you come to the door now?
Yeah, all right, mate. Just give us a chance to get some pants on, eh?
Yeah, I will.
Ivan at first responded by claiming it was a joke and not accepting it. However, there were noises that were heard in the house that suggests things probably weren't as calm as he was making out on the telephone. We believe now that he was taking the guns out, or at least a gun, out of the car and hiding it elsewhere in the house.
Knowing Ivan's obsession with the Rambo films, police moved into position for a shootout. Detective Gordon rang again.
There's some sort of joke. You've got to be having me on, haven't you? All right, be there in a tick.
Ivan Milat, step outside of the house. Move. Get your hands on your head.
Step out of the house now. Put your hands behind your head.
Step outside the house. Move out of the house.
Down on the ground. Put both hands on your head.
Move forward. Move forward.
Behind your head now. Down on the ground. Down on the ground. Down on your head.
Down on your face, quick. Keep your face down. Keep it down. Clear. Make sure you
Against the wall.
Get the woman over there.
Against the wall.
Get the woman over there. Get the woman secured. Don't move. Keep him there. Frisk him. Make sure he's got nothing on him. Seize him. Stay where you are. Stay where you are. Do not move, mate.
Good morning, Task Force Air. Sir, it's the command post at Eagle Vale.
Thank you. Small here. Good. Very good. They've got him. I want the full search, Tim, and now I want the house completely pulled apart.
The search of the house took 4 days. Inside it was an Aladdin's cave of incriminating evidence. Hidden inside a cavity in the wall, they found the disassembled parts of the .22 Ruger rifle. Bullets fired from the rifle would later match those found at the murder scenes. Inside a work bag, they found a 12-inch Bowie knife, and guns of all kinds were taken from every room. In a wardrobe in one of the bedrooms were sleeping bags belonging to Simone Schmiedel and Deborah Everest. A framed photograph of Chalinda Hughes showed her wearing Caroline Clarke's striped Benetton top.
Yeah. Ivan remained with us at the house while the search was being conducted for a considerable period, and then later he was taken to the Campbelltown police station where police started to conduct an interview with him. After about one moment he declined to be further interviewed. Has never said anything to this day.
This man is a serial killer. Ivan Milat cruised the Hume Highway luring young backpackers to their deaths. The middle-aged road worker who called himself Texas and Bargo Bill, who liked to dress up as a cowboy, savagely killed 7. But for Milat's girlfriend, there is only disbelief.
Well, I didn't believe it, so I couldn't accept it. I couldn't accept what they were saying.
Were you shocked?
Yeah.
And I just thought this was a horrible mistake.
His younger brother, George, knew Ivan was violent, but never thought he was a killer.
Ivan's told me that quite a few times. Don't take a life, and he's not the only one in my family who said, don't take a life. Give him a good bloody eye. And the old man said, you're going to give him a eye, give him a good one. Really built the hell out of him, but don't kill him.
Ivan Milat was charged with the murders of the 7 backpackers and the attempted murder of Paul Onions. the biggest ever murder trial in Australia would last nearly 3 months, Ivan Milat pleaded not guilty to all 8 charges. The prosecution's first witness was Paul Onions, who immediately identified Ivan as the man named Bill who had tried to kill him. Ivan's defense was simple. He denied everything. When faced with questions he could not answer, he would incriminate his brother Richard and say, "Someone's trying to make me look bad."
In a desperate bid to escape the charges, Milat even tried to blame one of his brothers, but the jury rejected the defence suggestion that Richard Milat might be the murderer.
There are 2 theories. One that he was alone, the other that he was with somebody else, maybe a member of his family. His brother Richard has been mentioned. Brother Richard denies that. I think Ivan acted on his own. I think he was that sort of guy. All the evidence to me pointed to him being a loner, and I don't think Ivan would have entrusted him to bring him along.
I've got no doubt that at least some members of Ivan's family believed that he was doing some horrible, nasty things to some people. But I don't know that they thought it was murder. Rather, I believe they thought that it was more a case of him simply raping women, which some people did not have a problem with.
The jury returned a verdict of guilty on 7 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder.
Justice David Hunt told the jury he entirely agreed with their verdicts and immediately moved to sentence. His voice cracking with emotion, he said Milat's callous indifference to suffering and complete disregard of humanity is almost beyond belief.
For each murder, Milat got life. In his sentencing, Justice Hunt said he did not believe Milat had acted alone.
It's always nice to get a 100% clear up and clear every matter up. Realistically, that's not always practical. The most important part here is that we had a person in Ivan Milat who was a serial killer who would have gone on killing until he was caught or died. He's been caught. He'll spend the rest of his life in jail. He'll never see daylight again. And that's where he should be. It does live with you for some time. It's not that you think about it every day, it's that from time to time you get a flashback, if you like, or some other case will come up which prompts you to remember or think about it, and you just say, I wish I could have gone that extra couple of 100 yards and just provided a complete closure for those members of the family. I think the saddest part of the case for me is the length of time the families of the victims had to go before they finally knew what happened to their children and that a person had been arrested and charged and was going to go to jail for life. There was some relief. They could get on with their own life now, knowing what had happened.
There are 16 other unsolved murders police believe Ivan Milat may be responsible for. Unless significant evidence comes forward, or Milat breaks his silence and talks, they will remain unsolved.